Present us, O Lord, in all our doings with thy most gracious favor, and further us with thy continual help, that in all our works begun, continued, and ended in thee, we may glorify thy holy name, and finally, by thy mercy, attain everlasting life. Amen. I have a statement concerning a question asked on May 3rd, 2018 during question period by the member for Saskatoon-Nutana. At page 4190 of Hansard, the member for Saskatoon-Nutana asked the Minister of Finance these questions. Doesn't she think women can do math as well as men can? Will the Finance Minister apologize for these comments? Pursuant to Rule 20, Sub 2 of the Rules and Procedures of the Legislative Assembly, a question must be connected to the government. Upon review, I find the question is about the personal viewpoint of the minister and not connected to the government. My concern does not end there. At page 624 of the House of Commons Procedure and Practice, 3rd edition, 2017, it states that the Speaker takes into consideration the intention of the member speaking and the person to whom the words at issue were directed. I have to ask, what was the intention of this question? Members know all too well, given many, many rulings from the chair, some as recently as a few weeks ago, that remarks which question a member's integrity, honesty, or character are out of order. The dictionary defines character as the moral qualities distinctive to an individual. Previously, I asked members to heed their own code of ethical conduct, to respect differences and treat each other with fairness in political dealings. In this instance, the question is out of order because it was not related to the government. It was also meant to reflect personally on the minister, which is also out of order and troubling. I ask the member for Saskatoon-Nutana to withdraw and apologize to the Assembly. I recognize the member for Saskatoon-Nutana.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I withdraw and I apologize.
Introduction of guests. I recognize the Premier.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would ask for leave for an extended introduction.
Premier has asked for leave for an extended introduction. Is leave granted? Recognize the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to members of this House. And through you, Mr. Speaker, and through all members to this House, I want to take a moment this morning to introduce to you some very special guests from the community of Spearwood in the constituency of Roster and Shelburne. And today with us, Mr. Speaker, we have Shelley Allard and her daughter Megan. Mr. Speaker, accompanying Shelley and Megan is Megan's aunt, Sister Alvina Marie Charlebois from Regina here. Mr. Speaker, Megan is a very special constituent in the constituency of Roster and Shelburne and a very important volunteer in the community of Spiritwood. And when you look at Megan's impressive resume, you very quickly begin to be able to see what a remarkable young woman she is. She is one of the most active volunteers in that community, Mr. Speaker, and her mom, Shelley, gets to be involved in all of those volunteer activities as well. She has led numerous fundraising initiatives in the community through her involvement with the Saskatchewan Association of Community Living. While attending Spiritwood High School, Megan was the driving force behind the World Down Syndrome Day, lots of socks events that she did for a number of years. Mr. Speaker, lots of socks encourages people to wear brightly colored socks or long socks or possibly just one sock. To raise awareness and to express the support for those in our community who perceive life a little differently. Megan was involved in the creation of an enterprise called New to You Clothing in Spiritwood, Mr. Speaker. New to You is now a major enterprise that collects clothing and donates it to the Saskatchewan Association of Community Living. Megan has served as a member of the Saskatchewan Association of Community Living's Provincial Board of Directors, and in 2015 she was recognized, Mr. Speaker, and I had the honour of attending the ceremony, but she was recognized by the Lieutenant Governor, Vaughan Solomon Schofield, as the Saskatchewan Junior Citizen of the Year. Since then, Megan has been deeply involved with the Spiritwood Lions Club, Mr. Speaker, involved in many activities in the community. She's volunteered at 2 seniors residents in the community. She was instrumental in securing a $3,500 donation to the Spiritwood Long-Term Care Home. And Megan does all of this while working at the local grocery store in the community. Mr. Speaker, Megan has had an excellent mentor and an excellent role model in her mom, Shelley. For many years, Shelley has been an enthusiastic volunteer in the community, although she concedes it's tough to keep up to Megan, and I agree with that. Shelley and Megan are actively involved in Ability in Me, or AIM, Mr. Speaker, an organization in Saskatoon that offers specialized therapy and programming to support individuals with Down syndrome. And we were just talking, Mr. Speaker, of Megan's new horse that she got 2 weeks ago, Philly, pardon me. Mr. Speaker, this evening a number of members will find out more about AIM at the reception that they're hosting here in the legislature, thus our visit, Mr. Speaker. And Winston Churchill once said this: "We make a living by what we get, but we make a life by what we give." Well, Shelley and Megan Allard have made an impressive life in the community of Spiritwood, a life that is most worthy of emulation. We owe them our gratitude for the incredible example they have provided for all of us here in this great province of Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, I ask all members to join me in welcoming these 3 individuals to their legislature. Hear, hear.
Recognize the member for Lumsden Morse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To you and through you, to all members of this Honourable Assembly, I'd like to introduce a group of 15 grade 9 to 12 students from Lumsden High School, accompanied by their teacher Daniela Machuca and educational assistants Lisa Magel, Pat Church, and Penny Tompkins, as well as Jenna Ross, who is seated on the floor of the legislature with student Kyra Burgess. Mr. Speaker, this is a very special class called Bridges, Building Relationships and Inclusion to Drive Goal-Based Educational Success. The course brings together students of all abilities from regular high school programs and from alternative education programming to meet individual and collective goals in the areas of life skills, community service, physical recreation, and social emotional skills. This semester, there are grade 12 students who act as leaders and mentors. The class was envisaged and established by another teacher, Heather Winter, who is not able to join us today. Mr. Speaker, I hope that all members of this Honourable Assembly will welcome these guests. On my feet, Mr. Speaker, I'd also like to introduce to you and through you to all members of this Honourable Assembly Fred Retzlaff, also seated in your west gallery, Mr. Speaker, Executive Director of Agri-Stability at Saskatchewan Crop Insurance Corporation. Fred has worked for over 40 years in the agriculture industry and in banking and delivering risk management programs. For the last 10 years, Fred has been working with SCIC on the Agri-Stability program. Fred was instrumental in transitioning the delivery of Agri-Stability program from the federal government to the Saskatchewan Crop Insurance Corporation. Fred says that when Agri-Stability was delivered by the federal government, one of the most significant complaints to his office was about the delivery. Since SCI took over, a number of complaints has decreased to almost zero. I understand that Fred is retiring on May 18th, and I would like to congratulate and thank him for his contributions to the farmers and ranchers of this province, and welcome him to his legislative assembly.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Stonebridge, Dakota.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In your gallery, I'd like to welcome Anne Gent. Anne is a senior environmental scientist with Cameco. She's also chair of Women in Mining and Women in Nuclear in Saskatchewan. She and I met earlier this afternoon. We had a lovely chat. I also discovered she's a constituent. And Anne has over 17 years' experience in environmental research, consulting, and regulatory compliance within the mining industry. She's active in promoting responsible resource development, as well as the clean benefits of uranium. She also strives to break down stereotypes of the industry and to promote STEM careers, particularly for women. Mr. Speaker, in Canada's mining industry, women account for 17% of the total mining labour force, 19% of the labour force in mining, quarrying, and oil and gas extraction. But those numbers are growing, and as Anne herself said recently, our goal is to change preconceptions women may have of the mining industry and to educate and promote women into the mining and minerals sector as the great career choice that it is. Please join me, Mr. Speaker, in welcoming Anne to her Legislative Assembly.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Silver Spring, Sutherland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To you and through you, I'd like to introduce to the Assembly my parents, Ted and Marie Merriman, who are seated on the floor. I'm a little more nervous about doing this introduction than I am about question period, Mr. Speaker, because I don't want to miss anything. They've had a very great career. My father was elected in 2003 to 2007, sitting with the Saskatchewan Party in opposition, and was very pivotal in moving the Saskatchewan Party forward and helping them form government under then leader Brad Wall and then, of course, Premier Brad Wall. My mother, she's the heartbeat of our family. She always has been and always will be, Mr. Speaker. My dad grew up on the wrong side of the tracks, I'd have to say, in Toronto. That was the bad news. He grew up with 5 brothers and 1 sister in a 2-bedroom place in Toronto. The good news is he found my mother on the other side of the tracks, and she brought him up and lifted him up, and they've been together ever since, Mr. Speaker. They walk hand in hand down the street. They have for close to 50 years, Mr. Speaker. Very proud of all of their community work that they have done. They set up many charities, Care and Share in Saskatoon, the most notable, but also my dad is a founding board member of AIM, which I see Megan was here to participate in the festivities. So again, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to welcome my parents. I love you both very much. Thank you for everything you've done. My sister and I and your 5 grandchildren, thank you for everything that you've done for your family. So I'd like to welcome them to their Legislative Assembly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Centre.
Thanks very much, Mr. Speaker. I too would like to join the Minister in welcoming Ted Merriman and Marie to this House. When Ted was elected in 2003, he was a very capable MLA, but a very, very capable critic. And he kept us hopping, so he is a good man, and I know he took everything to heart and continues to take everything to heart, and we are very fortunate to have him here in Saskatchewan. So I'd ask all members to join me in the opposition in welcoming Ted and Marie to their legislature. Thank you.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Northwest.
Mr. Speaker, to you and through you, I'd be remiss if I didn't stand, Mr. Speaker, and speak about Ted and Marie. For the interest of everyone in the House, Ted was the one that got me interested in politics. So to the extent that I owe any apologies to anybody, they can blame Ted Merriman for that. But Ted got me involved in politics, Mr. Speaker, many years ago. He convinced me to run as trustee for the Saskatoon School Board. And from there, we had some conversations about whether I should run for City Council and then ultimately run for MLA in Saskatoon Northwest. Mr. Speaker, I've appreciated the support that Ted and Marie have given me over these many years. I've learned lots of lessons, Mr. Speaker, and I have to thank them very much. So I'd be remiss if I didn't stand up and put on the record, Mr. Speaker, my heartfelt thanks to both Ted and Marie for all the support and all the encouragement that they've given me over these many years in politics, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Recognize the member for Moosomin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure today to introduce 2 constituents of Moosomin constituency, Tyler Tomlinson and Dale Hardy, sitting in the West Gallery. Both of them are just stalwarts of the community, both business owners, and Tyler's a pharmacist, and Dale's been in agribusiness for years, and they both work tirelessly in the community, especially volunteering on sports teams and organizations. And I know Dale Hardy's been involved with the Grenfell Spitfires for many years, and sitting beside him is Mark Schneider, who I believe runs the entire Ministry of Highways. And he's also a proud Spitfire alum. Tyler, of course, is a councillor in Grenfell, and he's a pharmacist there, and he's been instrumental on my executive as membership chair. He's done a great job for us there. So I'd like to ask all members of the Assembly to welcome these two individuals to their Assembly.
Presenting petitions. Oh, sorry, one more. Presenting petitions, you guys here first. All right, recognize Swift Current.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today to present a petition from citizens who are opposed to the federal government's decision to impose a carbon tax in the province of Saskatchewan. I'd like to read the prayer. We in the prayer that reads as follows: respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan take the following action: to cause the Government of Saskatchewan to take the necessary steps to stop the federal government from imposing a carbon tax on the province. Mr. Speaker, this petition is signed by the citizens of Shell Lake, Mont Nebo, Turtle Lake, Big River, and Leoville. I do so present.
Recognize a member for Cumberland.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to present a petition in support of mental health and addiction services in the North. Northern Saskatchewan has one of the highest rates of suicide in the country. The Children's Advocate has put out a report stating the lack of services in the North. The suicide rate is 6 times higher for First Nation boys than non-First Nation boys between the age of 10 and 19, and 26 times higher for First Nation girls than non-First Nation girls. And the prayer reads, we in the prayer that reads as follows: respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call upon the Sask Party government to treat Northern Saskatchewan residents with respect and dignity, and to immediately invest in more mental health and wellness programs and facilities in the North. It is signed by many good people of Northern Saskatchewan. I so present.
As a member for Regina Rosemont.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. I rise to present petitions on behalf of concerned citizens that are standing up and speaking out against the Sask Party government's devastating cut to the rental housing supplement, a cut that really hurts those on the tightest of margins across our province, people living with disabilities, families, low-income families with children, Mr. Speaker. And the prayer reads as follows. We in the prayer that reads as follows respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Sask Party government to immediately restore the Saskatchewan rental housing supplement. And these petitions are signed by concerned residents from Regina and Saskatoon. I so submit.
Recognize the member for Regina Lakeview.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to present a petition calling on the government to stop cuts to our children's classrooms. Those who have signed this petition, Mr. Speaker, wish to draw our attention to the cuts, the year-over-year cuts in education that have been experienced, and those who have signed this petition also know that backfilling $30 million of a $54 million cut is still a $24 million cut that has impacts on classrooms all around this province. I'll read the prayer. We, the undersigned, call upon the government to reverse the senseless cuts to our kids' classrooms and stop making families, teachers, and everyone who works to support our education pay the price for the Sask Party's mismanagement. Mr. Speaker, those who have signed this petition today reside in Melville and Regina. I do so present.
Recognize a member for Saskatoon Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to present a petition to get big money out of Saskatchewan politics. And the undersigned residents of this petition from Saskatchewan want to bring to your attention the following: that Saskatchewan's outdated Election Act allows corporations, unions, and individuals, even those outside the province, to make unlimited donations to our province's political parties. And the people of Saskatchewan deserve to live in a fair province where all voices are equal and money cannot influence politics. And Mr. Speaker, we know that over the past 10 years, the Saskatchewan Party has received $12.61 million in corporate donations. Of that, $2.87 million coming from companies outside Saskatchewan. You know, Mr. Speaker, Saskatchewan politics should belong to Saskatchewan people. So I'd like to read the prayer, Mr. Speaker. We in the prayer that reads as follows: respectfully request that the Government of Saskatchewan call on the Sask Party to overhaul Saskatchewan's campaign finance laws, to end out-of-province donations, to put a ban on donations from corporations and unions, and to put a donation limit on individual donations. And Mr. Speaker, the people signing this petition come from the City of Regina. I do so present. Thank you.
Reading and receiving petitions. Statements by members. Recognize the member for Saskatoon-Riversdale.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today to recognize International Nurses Week from May 7th to May 13th, first established by the International Council of Nurses in 1965. On May 12th, Mr. Speaker, the birthday of Florence Nightingale is recognized as International Nurses Day. The Canadian theme for Nursing Week 2018 is Yes, This is Nursing. Nursing roles are evolving at an exponential rate, particularly with the influence of technology and the expansion of digital technologies. This year's theme speaks to the expanding traditional and non-traditional roles, settings and sectors in which nurses work, as well as the unique opportunities for nurses presented by social media and emerging technology trends. Mr. Speaker, right now there is a nurse helping a woman become a mother, a nurse holding a dying man's hand, a nurse starting a child's IV, a nurse listening to an Alzheimer's patient tell a story, a nurse missing their family while caring for others. The role of nurses are many and varied. They don't only work as nurses at the point of care, but also as educators, nurse practitioners, policymakers, advocates, and researchers. Nurses are there for us in our ordinary and in our extraordinary times. This week draws attention to nurses, increasing the awareness of the public, policymakers and governments of the many contributions of nursing to the well-being of Canadians. Mr. Speaker, I ask all members to join with me in celebrating and saying thank you to all members of the nursing team for their hard work and dedication this week and every week. Thank you.
Recognize the member for Batoche.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, May 7th to 13th is Mental Health Week here in Canada. This week has been observed since 1951, when Canadian Mental Health Association first introduced the idea to raise awareness to mental health illness in Canada. Our government recognized the importance of providing appropriate and timely access to mental health services. This year, a total new investment of $11.4 million is being targeted to improve mental health services in Saskatchewan. Almost half of that funding is for enhancing services and supports for children, youth, and families. Overall, the health system invests $284 million on mental health services and support this year. Mr. Speaker, Saskatchewan's 10-year Mental Health and Addictions Action Plan continues to guide and set the priority areas for mental health and addiction investment in Saskatchewan. Our recent budget investment aligns with the action plan and increased access to mental health treatment for adults, children, and youth, and expands suicide prevention efforts. During this important week, Mr. Speaker, we all have a responsibility to raise awareness of mental health issues and to work to reduce the stigma associated with mental health illness. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon-Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On May 4th, I had the pleasure of attending the chartering ceremony of the Saskatoon chapter of Executive Women International.
Hear, hear. Hear, hear.
Executive Women International was founded in San Francisco in 1938 by Miss Lucille Johnson Perkins, who recognized the importance and potential of an association bringing women together to promote their firms and to improve their communities. EWI is a nonprofit group of professional men and women who join together to support one another professionally. More than 1,400 member companies and 1,600 representatives continue to thrive in EWI today in nearly 45 chapters located in the United States and Canada. The Saskatoon chapter was started just over a year ago with founding members Karen Skirton and Serena Dallas. In addition to providing networking and professional development opportunities, EWI of Saskatoon supports the local community through their Assist Scholarship Program and has a close relationship with Reed Saskatoon. This weekend, EWI Corporate Board President Cheryl Hawkins came from Washington State for this important occasion. A dinner was held at the Hilton Garden Inn after the group toured Wanuskewin Heritage Park, the Berry Barn, and the Ramey Art Gallery. I would like to congratulate the current president of EWI of Saskatoon, Alyssa Thompson, and the entire board on achieving their chapter status. I want to invite all members to join me in congratulating EWI of Saskatoon on their recent chartering ceremony and thank them for their contributions to our community.
Recognize a member for Saskatoon University.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This weekend I had the pleasure of attending on behalf of the Premier the launch of Locals Only in Saskatoon. I was joined by the member from Saskatoon Centre. Locals Only is a non-traditional partnership between AKA Artist Run and CHEP Food Inc. Mr. Speaker, this youth-led art project will offer art and healthy food to residents in Saskatoon's core neighbourhoods. This partnership will feature work by artists from Saskatoon and Canada with projects based on how we grow food, how we cook for one another, as well as care for our neighbourhoods. Along with the artwork, residents can look forward to healthy, fresh foods that will be provided by 3 mobile art and food carts. The art and food carts will be deployed not only to provide healthy food to communities, but to also spark a meaningful conversation on food security and community relationships. I had the opportunity as well to speak to Michael Peterson, Project Manager of Locals Only, and Yvonne Hansen, Executive Director of CHEP, about their unique partnership, what they will achieve, and how they will build upon their success. Saskatoon's central core is becoming more diverse and more multicultural, and the Locals Only project looks at this change as an opportunity for intercultural exchange and focuses on ways to share and celebrate culture on many levels. Mr. Speaker, I ask that all members please join me in congratulating the members from AKA and CHEP Food Inc. on a successful launch and thank them for introducing such an important project. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize a member for Melfort.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last Thursday, more than 70 people walked a mile down Melfort's main street in shiny red heels to raise awareness for an important cause. The International Walk a Mile in Our Shoes event is an opportunity to raise awareness about the serious causes and effects of sexual violence against women. The old saying, don't judge someone until you've walked a mile in their shoes, has much more meaning when they're 4-inch pumps, Mr. Speaker. Uneven ground, drainage grates and gravel were a few small obstacles that we'd faced, but Mr. Speaker, this event is to raise support for women and children who have to overcome massive challenges that no one should have to face. Mr. Speaker, this year we paid tribute to former Melfort Mayor and MLA Kevin Phillips after his untimely passing. Kevin was a champion for the Northeast Outreach Shelter, and together with Louise Schweitzer, he was able to see their dreams become a reality. This was the 6th annual Walk a Mile in Melfort. There were speeches from Louise Schweitzer and Kevin's wife April, inspiring us with their strength to continue on the cause. You did a great job yourself, Mr. Speaker, with your speech and started us off with Kevin's inspiring words, "Let's get her done." Louise said that this year's event raised approximately $10,000, and we appreciate all who donated to this worthy cause, and I ask that all members join with me thanking everyone who supported the Walk a Mile in Her Shoes event. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Moose Jaw, Waccamaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm honored to rise in the House today to recognize the sacrifice that our Canadian and Saskatchewan veterans made during the Battle of the Atlantic. Ranging from 1939 to 1945, this was the longest continuous battle of the Second World War. Canada played a key role in the battle as Allied forces valiantly fought to keep crucial supply lines to Europe open during the war. More than 70,000 Allied seamen, merchant mariners, and airmen lost their lives during the battle, including some 4,600 Canadians. Many of those that died were lost to the sea, with no gravesite to mark their sacrifice. Their valor and bravery were a crucial contribution to the ultimate victory of the Allied forces. Mr. Speaker, to pay tribute to these heroes, a Battle of the Atlantic memorial service was held on Sunday, hosted by the HMCS Queen here in Regina. Among the many dignitaries attending was the Lieutenant Governor, the Honourable W. Thomas Malloy, and the Director General, Maritime Equipment Program Management, Captain Christopher Earle. Mr. Speaker, at the service, the name of each ship that was lost was read aloud and a bell was rang, symbolizing the end of that cruise watch. While the sailors' watch has ended, their sacrifice will never be forgotten. We will remember them. Thank you.
Recognize the member for Estevan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to rise in this Assembly to acknowledge May as Kids Sport Month here in Saskatchewan. The month was proclaimed to raise awareness about the organization and all the work that they do. Kids Sport is a children's charity which assists children of families facing financial obstacles to participate in community sport programs so that all kids can play. Their mission is to ensure no kids are left on the sidelines, and all should be given the opportunity to experience the positive benefits of organized sport. The charity has branches all across Saskatchewan and Canada. Mr. Speaker, it's incredibly important that we ensure our kids have the opportunity to participate in organized sports. Sports allows our kids to gain physical fitness while achieving social, intellectual, and moral development. I think I would be safe in saying all members of this House have fond memories of organized sports, as well as friendships started there that probably continue today. I'm proud that our government continues to invest in programs like Kids Sport through funds raised by Saskatchewan Lotteries. $23.7 million was invested in programs that support a volunteer-driven delivery support system in sports, culture, and recreation last year. Mr. Speaker, on behalf of this entire Assembly, I want to thank Kids Sport for everything they do for the children of our province. Thank you.
Question period. I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, former Premier Brad Wall spent the weekend at the founding convention of the right-wing coalition United Conservative Party of Alberta. Yesterday, a motion was passed at that convention that undermines the rights to privacy and safety for youth in Alberta. Mr. Speaker, this discriminatory motion, which seeks to repeal a law protecting the rights of young people to decide when and how to tell their parents about having joined a gay-straight alliance, not only directly violates these students' rights to privacy, it puts LGBTQ+ youth in potential harm and tries to dismantle networks of safety that are so necessary for their health and well-being. GSAs are critical to ensuring that LGBTQ+ students have the supports that they need, free from risk, from harm, from discrimination. Mr. Speaker, this move by the Sask Party's Conservative cousins has Saskatchewan students seeking some assurance that the Sask Party won't follow suit. So does the Premier agree that every Saskatchewan student should have the fundamental right to join a gay-straight alliance and to decide for themselves how and when to tell their parents? And can he assure the people of Saskatchewan that he supports confidential gay-straight alliances in the province's school system?
Recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, in this province we have a policy in our school divisions, Mr. Speaker, and in our schools across the province of Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker, and it's a policy, to my understanding, that is being adhered to and followed. Mr. Speaker, this policy was put in place, at the direction of the Ministry of Education, Mr. Speaker, was put in place in school divisions, and they've worked with communities, Mr. Speaker, including parents and including educators across our province, to develop policies, Mr. Speaker, in the formation of gay-straight alliances or similar groups, Mr. Speaker, in our schools. And the fact of the matter is that we are required, Mr. Speaker, to ensure the protection of privacy of individuals, Mr. Speaker, as per the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission in 2013, as I stated this, Mr. Speaker. In addition, if a school legitimately needs and collects personal information that either directly or indirectly identifies a person's sex as being different from their gender identity, the school must ensure that that individual's privacy is protected and the information is kept confidential. End quote, Mr. Speaker. There you go.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and that's very reassuring. I hope that that will be communicated to the UCP members in Alberta, that that's something we encourage them to do as well.
Here, here.
Mr. Speaker, physicians are raising the alarm because across the province, people are waiting 5 to 6 weeks for biopsy results, weeks that are crucial for timely and effective care. Lab services have been cut in communities across the provinces, and getting test results, as one physician has said, and I quote, is a terrible logistical problem. Mr. Speaker, the minister wasn't able to answer doctors' questions on this issue last week, so can the Premier tell us today, what's the plan to address these unacceptably long waits?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This, as the member alluded to, this issue was raised on Friday at the SMA's Saskatchewan Medical Association Assembly by a doctor from Swift Current. Our officials followed up with that doctor. We're looking into the matter. We're extremely concerned by that. I'm advised that a number of factors may be involved in that, including sample volumes and the complexity of the testing. I'm also advised that Regina, that's where the Swift Current ones are done, Mr. Speaker, that Regina currently has a 16-day backlog, but that processing time depends on the type of sample and urgency. Mr. Speaker, none of the changes to this process have been made since the formation of the Provincial Health Authority. However, we are extremely concerned about that. Officials are going to continue to look at this and brief me as soon as possible within the next number of days. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Along with cuts to lab and diagnostic services across the province, one of the key reasons that the minister didn't mention that is behind the inexcusable delays in cancer testing and treatment today is the closure of the Saskatchewan Transportation Company a year ago. In a Ministry of Health assessment of the impacts of the closure of STC that we've obtained through access to information, the changes for cancer care were specifically detailed, including anticipated impacts on patients who rely on the bus to get to and from appointments, on the shipping of drugs and other supplies, as well as the loss of overnight delivery, which STC was able to provide, but courier services do not. Mr. Speaker, the health care services of rural people are just as important as anyone else in the province, but this party continues to take rural Saskatchewan for granted. To the Premier, what action, if any, has this government taken in the year since STC?
This party, this is a government, and opposition, thanks.
Sask Party government continues to take rural Saskatchewan for granted. To the Premier, what action, if any, has the government taken in the year since they shut down STC to address the logistical challenges that the closure has on wait times and the healthcare system and the disproportionate impacts on the health of people in rural areas?
Recognize Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, there's sort of two parts of that question. First of all is the impact on people getting to appointments, and the second part is lab tests and logistics on that, Mr. Speaker. I'll get to that one in a minute. As far as the impact on people making appointments, Mr. Speaker, in the Northern Medical Transportation Program that provided funding for emergent and non-emergent medical transportation, Mr. Speaker, the bus company accounted for less than 1% of the trips to medical appointments, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as far as the labs, Mr. Speaker, up until the wind down of STC, we'd only been using STC for about 9 months. Previous to that, they were using courier system, Mr. Speaker, and years previous to that, it would change periodically. So, Mr. Speaker, there are courier systems throughout the province that handle this just like they do in every other province. Other provinces don't own a bus company, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, depending on the year, the subsidy that STC would require would be anywhere from $10 to $20 million, Mr. Speaker. I would suggest that money could better be used on frontline health care.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon-Nutana.
Mr. Speaker, last week the Minister of Justice sloughed off concerns about transparency at the GTH, minimizing the Privacy Commissioner's report that showed the GTH was not following Freedom of Information law. He claimed he doesn't get involved in their day-to-day operations. Well, the minister responsible is the Minister of Justice, and as we have seen, he likes to give lectures about the rule of law. The minister claims that the opposition is getting in the way of the success of the project, but I think he should take a long, hard look in the mirror, Mr. Speaker. If he wants to clear the air, the minister should be reminding the folks at the GTH that the FOI process isn't a PR exercise, it's the law. Will the minister do his part in clearing the air and direct the GTH to follow the Privacy Commissioner's recommendations and release those documents?
Recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the member opposite for the question. We appreciate, respect and value the work of the Information and Privacy Commissioner and his staff. The GTH will take the appropriate amount of time to consider the recommendations. Under the legislation, the GTH has 1 month to respond and advise parties of its intentions. The GTH will meet that obligation, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's the intention of this government to ensure that the GTH grows and prospers. We've certainly used some support from the opposition in recognizing the successes that have taken place out there. We certainly appreciate their acknowledgement that there's a facility out there that operates 24 hours a day, 7 days a week with 750 employees. We'd appreciate their recognition that there's employees from 47 different cultures. Each time someone from a new country is hired, a new flag is flown over there. And Mr. Speaker, their recognition of that would certainly help.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon-Newtana.
Mr. Speaker, this government can't have it both ways. On the one hand, day after day, members opposite stood in this Assembly defending the GTH mess with quotes from the provincial auditor, an independent officer of this legislature. But when it comes to another independent officer, the Information and Privacy Commissioner, this government looks the other way. The Sask Party has funneled more than 150 million taxpayers' dollars to the GTH. So Saskatchewan taxpayers deserve full transparency, or the very least, that the law is being obeyed. So again, to the minister, will he step in and call on the GTH to listen to the Information and Privacy Commissioner and release those records?
Hear, hear. Recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, the member opposite has spent a lot of years practicing law. She's been in this House for a number of years, and she knows full well how the legislation works. She wants us to comply with the law. Mr. Speaker, the law says 30 days. The GTH is working with the Information and Privacy Commissioner to ensure that commercially sensitive matter is protected, and that the rights of the citizens to know and be fully apprised of how their taxpayers' dollars are being spent takes place. And Mr. Speaker, we support that, and we want to see to it that they do comply with the law, and we will in fact do that. Mr. Speaker, once again, I would like to see to the members opposite work to support the good things that are taking place out there. Mr. Speaker, I'd mentioned the number of different cultures, the number of different countries that are represented by the employees that work there. Mr. Speaker, CP Rail has got a container port there. 60,000 containers move through that facility every year. And Mr. Speaker, we want to see that grow.
Here. Recognize the member for Prince Albert Northcote.
Mr. Speaker, as an MLA for the Prince Albert area, the Premier would be well aware on the ongoing problems at Victoria Hospital in Prince Albert. The hospital is regularly over capacity, and demand for services has been climbing each year. This is why community members were encouraged to hear the Premier commit to building a new hospital in Prince Albert, one fully funded by the province. On the campaign trail, the Premier said the project would go forward at the end of the government's 3-year plan. But in his tours with the Finance Minister last week, the Premier muddied the water, saying the timeline will be when we can afford it. This doesn't provide much comfort for the people of Prince Albert. When can the people of Prince Albert expect the hospital the Premier promised?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, we are committed to the hospital in Prince Albert. Mr. Speaker, in fact, to date, $3.1 million has been committed to advanced work being done in that, Mr. Speaker, a number of things, including planning for the hospital. Mr. Speaker, what the Premier very clearly said was that we would pay for the entire cost of the hospital, Mr. Speaker. It makes sense. It's a huge service delivery unit for that entire part of the province, Mr. Speaker. He said we would pay for it when finances permit. Mr. Speaker, we are committed to that.
Recognize the member for Prince Albert Northcote.
Mr. Speaker, budgets are about choices, and if the Premier was serious about the commitment he made to the community of Prince Albert, he would keep his word and allocate the funding for this desperately needed hospital in the next budget. The Finance Minister told community members she believed the new hospital for Prince Albert would be the next major infrastructure project for this government. Can the Minister confirm this today? Can the people of Prince Albert and area expect to see funding for this project in the next budget?
Recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, with $5.77 billion invested in this year's health budget, this province has come a long way, Mr. Speaker. We have come from a jurisdiction where we had the longest wait times for surgeries, Mr. Speaker, to one of the shortest wait times here in the nation of Canada, Mr. Speaker. We have built infrastructure across this province, both in 15 rural long-term care and integrated health care facilities, Mr. Speaker, and we have invested in urban Saskatchewan and hospitals for all Saskatchewan people, like the Children's Hospital, Mr. Speaker, and a 100-year-old Saskatchewan hospital in the community of North Battleford, the Moose Jaw Hospital, Mr. Speaker, and we continue to invest in infrastructure as we move forward, much-needed infrastructure that was not invested, Mr. Speaker, by the members opposite when they had the opportunity. A long-term care facility in Meadow Lake, Mr. Speaker, needs to be replaced. We have a hospital in Weyburn, Mr. Speaker, that needs to be replaced, and we have a hospital in Prince Albert that serves not just the community of Prince Albert, but all of northern Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker. We continue to invest in infrastructure, over 900 doctors, over 3,000 nurses, Mr. Speaker, and we will continue to invest on behalf of the people of this great province.
Recognize the member for Athabasca.
Firm commitment for Prince Albert, Mr. Speaker, but time and time again, we ask the government to show that they've learned their lesson from the Regina bypass with their Saskatoon bypass. But instead of taking heed, Mr. Speaker, they just plow ahead like a French snowplow on the Regina bypass with no thought of the consequences. The provincial auditor chastised this Sask party government for posting the route online so land speculators could jump ahead of the process and make a killing. So what did they do with the plans for the Saskatoon bypass, Mr. Speaker? The exact same thing. They posted them online for everyone to see. Did the Highways Minister even read the auditor's report? And doesn't he realize this is exactly what caused the costs at the Regina bypass to spiral out of control?
Recognize the Minister of Highways.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I thank the member opposite for the question. And that's exactly what we did do. We have looked at the auditor's recommendations, and one of the recommendations that the auditor did make was if we were going to pursue with a highway or a network somewhere, that we do the land acquisitions way ahead of time, Mr. Speaker. What we are now is, I mean, the Saskatoon Freeway isn't on our 5-year, isn't on our 10-year plan, but what we are doing is narrowing the scope of where that freeway may go, Mr. Speaker, and we are looking at the planning stages on developing that. So not only where we know to go, but also the city knows where we're planning on going, so the developers can continue to grow where they want to go, and which doesn't elate to the pricing of the highway, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Athabasca.
Mr. Speaker, they've wasted hundreds of millions of dollars of taxpayer money at the Regina bypass, Mr. Speaker. Hundreds of millions. I really hope we don't see a repeat at the Saskatoon bypass, but unfortunately, it's deja vu all over again. They are failing to learn from their mistakes and follow the recommendations of the auditor, but Mr. Speaker, it's our children and grandchildren who are going to have to pick up that tab. There are billions of dollars at stake. Has the Highways Minister read the auditor's report? How is he going to make sure that the Saskatoon bypass doesn't turn into the same gong show that we've seen at the Regina bypass?
Recognize the Minister of Highways.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let's make it very clear. We are very proud of the Regina bypass and what it's done. That is a project that is on time and on budget. In fact, Mr. Speaker, we have opened overpasses ahead of schedule on that, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the Minister of Highways.
And the number one reason why we did the Regina bypass, obviously, Mr. Speaker, and I wish the members opposite would recognize it, is safety. Safety was our primary concern, Mr. Speaker, in the east side of the bypass. I could quote from fire rescue, from first responders on the east side of the city, where they've said the jaws of life used to go out on a daily occurrence on number 1 east of Regina. Now they can't remember when the last time it went out, Mr. Speaker. The communities like what's going on there, Mr. Speaker. They like the fact that there's no intersections, that they merge onto number 1 to come into Regina to come to work. It's a good project for the people that live out there. It's a safe project for the people that live out there. It's a good project for the province of Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Sask Party likes to tell us that their goal is to make Saskatchewan the best place in the country to live and work with a disability. But troubling numbers released last week raise serious doubts about their commitment. Since 2013-14, there were 333 people with disabilities working across government. But in 2017-18, there were only 241. That's 92 fewer people, a reduction of over 27%. To the Minister for the Public Service Commission, how can the Sask Party say that they're making our province a better place for people with disabilities when there are fewer and fewer people with disabilities working in government each and every year?
Good question.
Recognize the Minister of Social Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. First off, I think the opposition on the cross there has no leg to stand on whatsoever on the disability file, Mr. Speaker. What we've done in the disability is we created the SED program, Mr. Speaker. We are working with employment agencies to be able to employ people with intellectual and with physical disabilities, Mr. Speaker. But they want to talk about percentages and numbers, Mr. Speaker. I can certainly talk about the 440 wait list that was under there with people with intellectual disabilities, and the number that was thrown out at committee the other night, Mr. Speaker, by the member from Rosemont of 200 people sitting waiting for intellectual disabilities, which we confirmed is not accurate, Mr. Speaker. Again, our disability file is very strong, Mr. Speaker. The transition from Valley View, the people that we have moved on Valley View, Mr. Speaker, our record is phenomenal on disabilities, and I stand by everything that we've done. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
And as a member for Saskatoon Centre.
Mr. Speaker, that wasn't even close to an answer. I asked the Minister of Public Service Commission, and people with disabilities just want to work. This reduction in opportunities for people with disabilities is just not acceptable. Every single ministry reported a decline in the number of people with disabilities.
Could I have a little order from this proximity, please? That would be great. Recognize the member for Saskatoon Centre.
Mr. Speaker, every single ministry reported a decline in the number of people with disabilities who worked there, except for one ministry that saw an increase of 1 employee. This is a problem that is systematic and touches every single ministry in government. The overall size of the public service hasn't really changed that much since 2013, but the 27% reduction in the number of people with disabilities is huge. Why are there fewer people with disabilities working for the government, and what is the Sask Party going to do to increase their representation in the civil service?
Recognize the Minister of Central Services.
Thanks very much for the question, and this question came up in estimates last week, and we had a good discussion with the member from Regina Elphinstone as well. The Public Service Commission is committed to diversity, to allowing minority groups every opportunity to become members of the public service, and they are committed to those with disabilities. Each and every ministry is committed to ensuring that that it's a welcoming place to those with disabilities, and trying to do their best to do that. We encourage individuals to consider the Government of Saskatchewan as an option in their career path, and we continue to make it a priority. Is there more work to do, Mr. Speaker? Absolutely there is, but I'm confident we make the Government of Saskatchewan a career choice for individuals, and we are as welcoming as possible, and we will continue to strive to do better, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, potential Saskatchewan workers and employers are wondering where the jobs are. On May 1st, saskjobs.ca was officially shut down. Of course, the government prefers to use the term wind down, but Mr. Speaker, we saw what wind down meant for STC.
That's right.
Now, the minister will try and convince the people of Saskatchewan that everything is okay, but people looking for work and employers looking to hire need more than reassurance. To the minister, a very simple question. How many jobs were posted on saskjobs.ca 1 month ago, and how many are posted currently for Saskatchewan on the National Job Bank?
Hear, hear. Hear, hear.
Recognize the Minister of Trade.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We've had the opportunity to talk a bit about the Sask Jobs transition to the National Job Bank over the course of the last week or two here in this House and out in the Rotunda. I think we've put forward to the public a fulsome explanation for that, which is that we are going to see increased functionality, we are going to see increased usage, we are going to see just an overall better experience integrated with a number of federal programs as well with regard to labour market and immigration by working with the Government of Canada collaboratively on the transition to National Job Bank. This has been something we've been working on for literally years, Mr. Speaker. Other jurisdictions have made the same transition for the very same reasons, Mr. Speaker. We know there is going to be a period of transition. There is going to be a period where employers and those seeking jobs are going to be transitioning to the new site, but we are very confident that in the long term this is the right decision for the public and the right decision for the labour market.
Recognize the member. Sorry, recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, this transition isn't something that just started on May 1st. The government's been planning it for months, and there are currently thousands of fewer jobs posted. Since the minister didn't know, I'll help him out with the numbers. In Regina alone, over 1 month ago, there were 1,700 jobs on saskjobs.ca. As of today, there are approximately 500 postings, and that's just for Regina, Mr. Speaker. Now, either these jobs no longer exist, or the government's wind-down transition is not going according to plan. The new site is clearly not working for employers or employees, and Saskatchewan people can't afford another Sask Party government wind-down, Mr. Speaker. So how is the minister going to fix the mess he's created? Where are the jobs?
Hear, hear. Hear.
Recognize the Minister of Trade.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I said in my previous response and then previous responses to that, this has been a part of a long-considered plan to transition to a National Job Bank for a host of economic reasons that are going to benefit the labour market of this province in the long term. But, Mr. Speaker, I would actually like to give the NDP credit for one thing, and I often don't give the NDP credit for a bunch, but Mr. Speaker, the NDP have a unique and singular ability to be on the wrong side of every issue. This is one example, Mr. Speaker, but there are other examples. The carbon tax, Mr. Speaker, which is...
Well, that'll be the end of question period, but let's be very clear. Both sides are playing with the words, okay? So don't be sitting there and yelling at the chair knowing full well that you're both participating. That'll be the end of question period. Ministerial statements. Introduction of bills. Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Orders of the day.
Written questions. Question number 250 asked by Ms. Moen.
I recognize the Government Whip.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to order the answers to questions 250 through 252.
Ordered 250 to 252.
Government motions. The Honourable Mr. Duncan.
Stand.
Government orders. Committee of Finance.
Oh, yeah. Committee of Finance. Okay. I do now leave the chair for the Committee of Finance.
I'll call the Committee of Finance to order. The business before the committee is interim supply. I'll call on the Minister of Finance to make any opening comments that she may have and move the resolution.
Thank you, Mr. Interim supply is a temporary funding mechanism government uses to ensure key government programs continue uninterrupted while the main estimates are being reviewed and debated. For many years, Saskatchewan's interim supply was provided through one or more interim supply bills tabled at the beginning of each fiscal year. In 2008, the Financial Administration Act 1993 was revised to include provisions that automatically give each vote interim appropriation equal to 2/12 of its prior year appropriation. This appropriation is available only to continue programs that were established in the previous year, ensuring government's critical work continues uninterrupted while the new budget is being reviewed. These legislative changes, combined with a standardized parliamentary calendar, have eliminated the need for interim supply bills most years. This year, the Assembly agreed to a sessional order that revised the dates of the spring 2018 sitting. The 2018-19 budget was tabled on April 10th, and in accordance with revised calendar rules, completion date was deferred from May 17th to May 31st. As a result of this later session, the 2/12 interim supply provided through the Financial Administration Act 1993 will be insufficient to ensure all critical government programming continues without interruption in all votes. With this bill, we are seeking approval for $256 million of additional interim appropriation for 4 votes. This temporary appropriation supplements the 2/12 already provided and is subject to same restrictions. It is available only to ensure existing programming continues and is not provided to implement new budgetary measures. Amounts provided through this interim supply bill are considered part of the appropriation described in the main estimates, which are currently being reviewed through standing committees of the Legislative Assembly. This interim supply bill includes $107 million for the Ministry of Health, which due to scheduled payment dates must make 5 bi-weekly payments to the Saskatchewan Health Authority during the interim supply period. If the 5th payment is delayed, the Health Authority will be unable to meet key financial commitments, including its employee payroll. The bill also includes $80 million for the Ministry of Social Services. We are requesting this additional interim funding to ensure the ministry is able to fund its various assistance and support payments at current caseloads and meet key scheduled payments for the end of May and 1st of June. These include CBO payments, various assistance and support payments, and some employee payroll. These amounts generally support vulnerable individuals who require payment on a timely basis. And there is $65 million for the Ministry of Education. On January 1st, 2018, the Education Property Tax Act took effect, and the municipalities now remit most education property tax directly to the General Revenue Fund. As a result, school operating grants paid by the General Revenue Fund increased starting January 2018. This additional interim supply ensures the Ministry of Education can fully fund school divisions in May at the increased amount. Finally, there is $4 million for the Ministry of Justice and Attorney General vote to ensure it meets all employee payroll requirements through the interim supply period. Funding in the Ministry of Justice and Attorney General vote is primarily for ministry salaries, such as court worker salaries, and for grants to the Legal Aid Commission to help the Commission pay its salary and operating costs. This funding ensures those payments continue as scheduled. With this additional interim supply, we believe ministries and agencies funded through the General Revenue Fund will be able to meet their expenses and continue critical programming until the Main Appropriation Act is enacted. As such, I move, resolved that a sum not exceeding $256 million be granted to Her Majesty on account for the 12 months ending March 31st, 2019.
The Minister of Finance has moved the following resolution, number 1. Resolved that the sum not exceeding $256 million be granted to Her Majesty on account for the 12 months ending March 31, 2019. Is the committee ready for the question? The Minister of Finance has moved the following resolution, resolved that the sum not exceeding $256 million be granted to Her Majesty on account for the 12 months ended March 31, 2019. Is it the pleasure of the committee to adopt the motion? Carried. I recognize the Minister of Finance.
I move the following resolution. Resolved that toward making good the supply granted to Her Majesty on account of certain charges and expenses of the public service for the fiscal year ending March 31st, 2019, the sum of $256 million be granted out of the General Revenue Fund.
The Minister of Finance has moved resolution number 2, resolved that towards making good the supply granted to Her Majesty on account of certain charges and expenses of the public service for the fiscal year ending March 31, 2019, the sum of $256 million be granted out of the General Revenue Fund. Is the committee ready for the question? Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried. I recognize the Minister of Finance.
I move that the committee rise and that the chair report the committee has agreed to the resolutions and ask for leave to sit again.
It has been moved by the Minister of Finance that the committee rise and the chair report that the committee has agreed to the resolutions and ask for leave to sit again. Is that agreed? Agreed. Carried.
I recognize the chair of committees.
Mr. Speaker, the Committee of Finance has agreed to certain resolutions, has instructed me to report the same, and ask for leave to sit again.
When shall the resolutions be read a first time? I recognize Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the resolutions be now read the first and second time.
Minister of Finance moved that the resolution be now read the first and second time. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
First and second reading of the resolutions.
When shall the committee sit again? I recognize the Minister of Finance.
Next sitting, Mr. Speaker.
Next sitting, pursuant to Rule 32 Sub 1, the Minister shall move first reading of the appropriation bill. I recognize the Minister of Finance.
I move that Bill Number 130, the Appropriation Act 2018 Number 1, be now introduced and read a first time.
Finance has moved that Bill Number 130, the Appropriation Act 2018 Number 1, be now introduced and read the first time. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
First reading of this bill.
When shall this bill be read a second time? Recognize the Minister.
I recognize leave of the I request leave of the Assembly and under Rule 32(1)(e) that the bill be now read a second and third time.
The Minister has requested leave that the bill be now read a second and third time. Is leave granted? Leave has been granted. The Minister may proceed to move second and third reading. I recognize the Minister.
I move that Bill Number 130, the Appropriation Act 2018 Number 1, be now read a second and third time.
It has been moved by the Minister of Finance that Bill Number 130, the Appropriation Act 2018 Number 1, be now read a second and third time. Is the Assembly ready for the question? It's the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Second and third reading of this bill. Orders, adjourned debates. Item number 1, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 76, the Parks Amendment Act 2017. Mr. Witherspoon.
Recognize the member for Regina Elphinstone Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and as ever, good to take my place in this Assembly and to join debate on the issues of the day. In this case, Bill number 76, the Parks Amendment Act 2017. Mr. Speaker, there are a number of questions that arise from this particular piece of legislation that are better addressed in committee in terms of the kind of detail and the more complex line of questioning that is afforded in that venue, but certainly that this government is bringing what is provisionally known as the Porcupine Hills Area Provincial Park. It will be useful to have that broader discussion as to what, in terms of bringing together a number of existing recreational areas, recreational sites that are already existent, Mr. Speaker, and how that amalgamation into a broader provincial park, what the chief benefit of that will be, Mr. Speaker, and then in terms of the broader question of consultation as has been carried out. Now, there are a number of undertakings made in the Minister's second reading speech, and we take those at their face value. But we certainly have a number of questions that arise from individual First Nations that are involved in that particular region. I'm thinking, of course, of the camps, what are colloquially known as the Kamsack bands, Mr. Speaker, in terms of Key, Kisakus, and Cody. And in terms of, in one of those circumstances, Mr. Speaker, questions about the very leadership of the individual First Nation and the legitimacy thereof that's currently being batted back and forth in the courts, Mr. Speaker. So there's some questions that arise in terms of, you know, to what extent that the consultation has been carried out, what has been identified in terms of lands that constituted traditional use, and in terms of what safeguards are there in the legislation and in the plan going forward for the park, but as well, Mr. Speaker, the very question of who has been consulted with is a question that we'd like more detailed response to, Mr. Speaker. And again, it was good that when the bill was introduced, there was representation in the gallery from, in that case, Mr. Speaker, Key First Nation, and good to see those folks. But again, in terms of what's happening with the leadership, that has been thrown into question by court, and then what sort of fiduciary responsibilities arise from consultation that is not well-founded or is questionable in its basis, Mr. Speaker. We'll look forward to putting those questions to the Minister at greater length in the committee. But with that, Mr. Speaker, I'd certainly urge my colleague, the Government House Leader, when I sit down momentarily, to do what need be done to move this particular piece of legislation onto the committee stage so that we might have that very discussion, Mr. Speaker. But again, we have a number of questions that we'll be pursuing in committee as regards Bill number 76, the Parks Amendment Act 2017.
Member for Regina Elphinstone Centre. Is the Assembly ready for the question? Question for the Assembly is a motion that the Minister that Bill number 76, the Parks Amendment Act 2017, be now read a second time. Pledge the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Second reading of this bill.
To which committee shall this bill be committed? Recognize the Government House Leader.
I designate the Bill number 76, the Parks Amendment Act 2017, be committed to the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
This bill stands committed to the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Government orders, adjourned debates. Item number 2, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 82, the Sask Energy Amendment Act 2017. Ms. Chartier.
Recognize the member for Prince Albert Northcote.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to stand today to add some remarks with regards to Bill 82. This session, new to being the critic for Sask Energy, but I was a previous employee of Sask Power, and we work closely with Sask Energy employees as well, and so it's an area that I'm happy to commit to as well, and I love learning more about what they do. Mr. Speaker, I was reviewing the Minister's comments when he presented this bill, and I'm going to read some of his comments into the record. He had a quote saying, "These updates will allow the corporation to better serve private sector business opportunities to support growth and competitiveness." Mr. Speaker, I'm unsure of exactly what he means by that, and I'm sure we'll have a lot of time to discuss this in committee. My understanding is that there's changes within this bill to the exclusive rights for distribution and transportation of natural gas to support new business ventures. So I'm unsure if any companies have approached the government and expressed interest in this, and this is why these changes are coming forward at this point, and what kind of impact this can have on the public dividends if we allow privatization of some of these services or allow others to participate with distribution. I have to admit, Mr. Speaker, that this looks like this bill is used to privatize distribution, and it seems like it's a backdoor privatization plan. More information that the Minister provided indicate that these amendments will allow Sask Energy to provide efficiency and enhance safety to the corporation. So I feel that these are some fancy wording to try and make Saskatchewan residents believe that allowing competition, probably out of province or country competition in businesses, is a good thing. But the reality is that Saskatchewan residents will lose control over their Crown Corporation and lose power and control over rates and lose out on dividends. So I guess some questions would be, what would be the rates to these companies that would come forward? What would be the terms or conditions? And there was some talk about having an interest rate on overdue fees. So what is the government thinking when they make these discussions? Like when they're presenting this bill, there must have been some thought of what that's going to look like. So that'll be some discussion we'll have. allowing third-party trucking to qualified companies, and allowing operators the right to move high-pressure natural gas, access land, parcel boundaries. I'm wondering why this is something that's been implemented in this bill. What is wrong with the current practices? Was there some challenges? Was there some incidences? Was there some changes done with the current practices to address these concerns prior to deciding to change the whole act and take away power from Sask Energy? Has there been anything put forward before, and what were the successes and what were the challenges? Those are going to be some interesting questions to have. Of course, with most bills, when they're brought forward for amendment, there's some housekeeping, and this one is no exception. There's housekeeping to be current with recent case law and corporate policy, such as with language, and they're changing the fiscal year. So that's another interesting aspect. I'm not sure what is bringing that forward, so there'll be some questions with regards to that as well. There's updated legislation to reflect the closure of customer services to pedestrian traffic. And Mr. Speaker, I have to say that I know this has impacted the most vulnerable. We have people coming to our office and inquiring where they can speak to a customer service agent in person, because some individuals have little to no access to internet services or to telephone access as well. So I know that's been an issue too. In what ways are customers receiving their customer services, and what aspects has Sask Energy made it so that it's more convenient for customers? So there'll be some questions with regards to that. There's an amendment that makes the failure to comply with regulations an offense, and allowing for better enforcement of regulations. That's all important stuff. We want to ensure that regulations are being followed through. There's new provision that allows for the transportation of gas via third-party owned trucks subject with conditions. But this also means an order in council is no longer needed for each trucking firm wanting to engage in this business. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm wondering how there will be some level of accountability on who is getting this access, and how a person could be informed about that. There's also some changes to allow the corporation the right to enter premises and lands where the corporation has pipelines but gas service is not active. Mr. Speaker, I think that's an important aspect of this piece of legislation. I know this came about due to a recent court decision, but I know with my previous experience with working with some Sask Energy individuals that it's so very important for them to still keep it in contact with those power or those gas meters, ensuring that they're in good quality and safe standing, and they are the property of Sask Energy and so of us. So it's important that we ensure that they're in good quality shape and nobody's tampering with them, because things can become quite dangerous if people are tampering with them. So, Mr. Speaker, I have a lot of questions that I'm going to be bringing forward within committee. I am prepared to bring this bill forward to committee and to have this further discussion with the minister and his officials. So with that, I'm going to cease my remarks.
Assembly ready for the question? Question before the Assembly is a motion by the Minister that Bill number 82, the Sask Energy Amendment Act 2017, be now read a second time. Pleasure the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Second reading of this bill.
To which committee shall this bill be committed? I recognize Government House Leader.
I designate that Bill number 82, the Sask Energy Amendment Act 2017, be committed to the Standing Committee on Crown and Central Agencies.
This bill stands committed to the Standing Committee on Crown and Central Agencies.
Government orders, adjourned debates. Item number 3, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 86, the Child and Family Services Amendment Act 2017. Ms. Chartier.
Recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not going to go on very long here today as it relates to Bill number 86, the Child and Family Services Amendment Act. I do look forward to thorough questions in committee. I invite participation of stakeholders across the province, those that we've been consulting across the province. I invite the direct engagement of many, Mr. Speaker, because these are the kinds of changes that we need to make sure we get right. Far too often with this current Sask Party government, they truly fail to consult, fail to listen to stakeholders. And when it comes to the lives and the safety and the well-being of children across our province, we simply can't afford to not get it right. Mr. Speaker, I know many of the changes are described by the Minister as being housekeeping in nature, and if that's the case, it's that's well and good. We'll certainly want to make sure that there's not any unintended consequences to the changes that have been brought forward, and certainly it's those agencies and partners and First Nations and Métis organizations across the province, youth organizations across the province that will know this best. So I ask them to make sure they assess this legislation and to be in touch on this front. Their input is really important. That being said, it's disappointing as well to have legislation brought forward to this Assembly and the time put to it, if it's only housekeeping in nature, Mr. Speaker, because for our children and young people all across our province, what they need is action to address the inequities and inequality that's so real, the conditions that so many face that are unfair and limiting of them living up to their full potential, Mr. Speaker. So we'll assess what the Minister means by housekeeping. What I hope is that means a modernization of language that's reflective of the needs of children and youth across the province. But where I'm disappointed is the lack of action, the lack of recognition by this Sask Party government of the incredibly challenging conditions that so many young people are living in across our province. The inadequate supports and services from a mental health perspective, Mr. Speaker, from an addictions perspective all across our province. And I would look to this government to take every opportunity to step up to the plate with the resources that are needed, but also the kinds of legislative changes that are needed to properly support young people all across our province. And in this province, where not unlike other provinces where we have a shameful history, Mr. Speaker, that includes things like the 60s scoop, we need a government to redouble efforts on every front to ensure fairness and respect and for all within the province. And as it relates to the 50s scoop, we still see a government that's delaying that very important apology, but also the important action towards reconciliation in a province that faces, and so many young people and so many families facing the intergenerational challenges and trauma of residential schools. Mr. Speaker, our children and youth deserve and need action and support from their government, and on occasion after occasion, we just simply, in file after file, we just don't see that with this Sask Party government. In fact, we see changes, of course, that are walking back supports for young people around the housing side as well. Now we see the scrapping of the rental housing supplement, Mr. Speaker, which provided very basic support but essential support for families with children living on with the lowest of incomes, Mr. Speaker, with the tightest of budgets, and peeling those dollars away from children in already vulnerable circumstances, from families, many of them already struggling with putting food into the cupboards in the fridge, Mr. Speaker, is simply not acceptable, and it's detrimental, of course, to those young people and families. It's detrimental to our province living up to, preventing our province from living up to its full potential. You know, I come before this Assembly, I served as an educator, and I apply that lens to many of the decisions that are made in this Assembly, and I know for certain that young people aren't able to learn if they don't have food in their belly or a stable roof over their head, and the kinds of choices that we see from this government are compromising those two very important pieces, and all those factors that are external to the classroom that directly impede learning, that are a direct barrier to learning, Mr. Speaker. But as I say, we'll engage in the changes that I think have been described by the minister mostly as housekeeping. We'll review those changes throughout the committee process. We invite, encourage those partners supporting children and youth all across the province to engage in this process, to reach out, to make sure that they're apprised of this legislation as well. Far too often with the Sask Party government, we see the Sask Party government making changes in isolation from those that are directly involved, the stakeholders, and in this case, Mr. Speaker, those directly involved in the well-being and care of children and youth across our province. So we'll look forward to time in committee, and certainly, as I say, I invite and encourage all across the province to assess this legislation and to connect with us through this important process. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Assembly ready for the question? Question for the Assembly is a motion by the Minister that Bill number 86, the Child and Family Services Amendment Act 2017, be now read a second time. Pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Second reading of this bill.
To which committee shall this bill be committed? Recognize Government House Leader.
I designate the Bill number 86, the Child and Family Services Amendment Act 2017, be committed to Standing Committee on Human Services.
This bill stands committed to the Standing Committee on Human Services.
Government orders, adjourned debates. Item number 4, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 89, the School Choice Protection Act. Mr. Vermette.
Recognize the member for Regina Lakeview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is my pleasure today to rise and enter into second reading debate on Bill number 89, the School Choice Protection Act. Mr. Speaker, this is a very important piece of legislation, and I am happy to have the opportunity to speak to it for a little bit today. We haven't seen this bill up too often on the order paper this session, and there are a lot of outstanding questions here that do remain outstanding. I want to first start by just affirming the official opposition's support for publicly funded education, and by that, Mr. Speaker, we mean both the separate and the public school systems. This bill, for some context, of course, came following the Justice Lay's ruling on the Theodore case, a case that goes all the way back to 2005, and a situation in this province that has seen mediation, has seen a great deal of attention, and remains a very, very large outstanding question with regard to the way that funding is delivered in this province for publicly funded school systems. As we said, going back to when that ruling was announced, we recognized immediately as opposition that this was potentially a very impactful decision, and we called immediately for support for the appeal. When this court challenge was undertaken, I think it was the general understanding of almost all parties involved that this would be a case that would not only have ruling at the Court of Queen's Bench, but at the Court of Appeal and most likely the Supreme Court level, Mr. Speaker, and that is something that we continue to hear from those in the sector. As I said, we immediately supported the appeal of this decision, recognizing that it would have a huge and potentially very quick, within a year, impact on many students and both school systems in the province, and it left a lot of questions for students, for parents, and for both school systems. We know that potentially it would have if implemented, would have seen between 5,000 and 10,000 students moving from one system to another. And it did create a great deal of uncertainty and concern for many students and parents in the province, as I did say. There is also a broader context that I think bears talking about, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and we saw this decision come down right after last year's budget, a budget that saw $54 million, more than $54 million taken out of the front lines of education in this province. We saw also in that budget, the Bill 63 was announced in the budget, a bill that really threatened to reduce the number of boards and wholly take over the powers of publicly elected school boards in this province. And of course, that is both the separate and the public boards. And there was a great deal of concern about that. Because it was a budget bill, we only saw 5 hours of scrutiny of that bill, but we sure heard a lot from the people of Saskatchewan. And so that was the context in which this decision came down. And we saw the then Premier move immediately to muse about the notwithstanding clause. Importantly, this clause is very rarely used in the country. I think any time that you endeavour to set aside the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, it should be met with a great deal of scrutiny and forethought. And that's immediately what we called for. But we saw the Premier musing about that even before the appeal was entered into. We do have a number of questions. I've had the opportunity to meet with boards around the province about this issue, and of course this has been top of mind for many boards in the province, as have, of course, the cuts to education, which is a separate issue, as well as the authority of boards that have been undermined by this government. So having the opportunity in committee to ask some more questions of this bill and think about the long-term consequences, potential consequences and implications of were this bill to be passed, I think it is incumbent upon all of us on both sides of the aisle, and to hear from those in the sector who, again, will be very impacted by decision. What we know now is that there was a date for a stay of judgment in April, which means that the ruling will not be implemented in the interim period while this appeal goes forward. We do know that Alberta and Ontario, both the public and Catholic school trustees associations, have entered in, have requested intervenor status in this case. Of course, it has implications not only in Saskatchewan, but in Alberta and in Ontario. And will continue to garner a great deal of scrutiny. We also know that as I mentioned, there is some expectation that this may be a case that is heard at the Supreme Court of Canada, and that will take several years for this case to wind through the Provincial Court of Appeal and to the Supreme Court level. What we know about the notwithstanding clause is that there is a 5-year sunset clause attached to it, so when it is invoked, governments have 5 years until it has to be revisited. We know that potentially could, that 5-year window could come before we see a ruling at the Supreme Court level. And the implications of that, I would like to have opportunity to talk to the minister and those in the sector about what that might mean. We also know that this bill, which I am told is rather unusual, is also it proposes to operate not only notwithstanding the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but also notwithstanding the Human Rights Code. and we have heard that there are some significant concerns about that as well. I think that, again, we affirm our support for the job that both systems do with regard to educating children in this province. The work of boards, the work of teachers and administration in both of those systems, and the very important work that they do despite some very trying circumstances, particularly as of late with the scarcity of resources in both systems, frankly, Mr. Speaker. And also the ability of both boards to work together towards solutions in that very trying, those very trying circumstances. I do sincerely look forward to the opportunity to sit down with the minister and his officials, and again, hopefully invite the participation of stakeholders to committee, so we can give this a really thorough going over and be very thoughtful and goal-focused with regard to this bill, and ensure that there is proper oversight, and just giving the notwithstanding clause the scrutiny that is deserved. With that, Mr. Speaker, I think I will conclude my remarks and am prepared to see this bill move to committee.
Assembly ready for the question? Question for the Assembly is a motion by the Minister that Bill number 89, the School Choice Protection Act 2017, be now read a second time. It's a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Second reading of this bill.
To which committee shall this bill be committed? I recognize Government House Leader.
I designate that Bill number 89, the School Choice Protection Act 2017, be committed to the Standing Committee on Human Services.
This bill stands committed to the Standing Committee on Human Services.
Listen to it.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 5, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 90, the Heritage Property Amendment Act 2017. Ms. Beck.
Recognize the member for Regina, Elphinstone Centre.
Thanks very much, Mr. Speaker. Good to join debate again this afternoon and take my place to share a few remarks on Bill number 90, the Heritage Property Amendment Act 2017. Certainly, Mr. Speaker, the heritage property regime in the province of Saskatchewan is one that is of ongoing concern, and certainly one that has been part of the public discourse, and how that relates to decisions of this government, particularly as regards to expenditure around Heritage Foundation, Mr. Speaker, and the presentation of those funds, Mr. Speaker, at budget time. Certainly, Mr. Speaker, the question of the in focus with Bill number 90, wherein it changes the duties of the review board to ensure operational separation from the rest of the foundation, and wherein the review board will now consist of at least 3 people who are appointed solely to carry out review board duties, wherein it updates the rules for hearings before the review board, including a party's right to be heard and the ability to accept any evidence deemed relevant, and also updating how the board will notify the public of the time, date, location of a heritage property hearing, and also wherein it adds a section to allow for more efficient processes for amending existing provincial heritage property designations. Mr. Speaker, this is a piece of legislation that's of particular interest to myself, coming out of Regina Elphinstone Centre, where heritage property, as late as this weekend in the Regina Leader-Post, property in the warehouse district, and its relationship to the municipal heritage regime was the subject of some discussion. And certainly, Mr. Speaker, in terms of making sure that your legislation is up to date and as efficient and as effective as possible, is certainly something that any piece of legislation should be. Certainly it should be the goals for legislation in any case for the government. And in this case, Mr. Speaker, we'll have more particular questions around the legislation and its force and effect. But we do note, and again, this will be grist for more significant and thoroughgoing discussion at committee stage, Mr. Speaker, wherein I would draw members' attention to a letter to the editor. In this case, it ran in the Regina Leader-Post. The editorial dated, or the letter, in the edition, the 1st November 2017 edition, and the letter slash editorial is entitled "Province Needs to Prove that Heritage Matters," and government must back preservation, conservation, writes Dr. Merle Massey. And Dr. Massey hails from Biggar, but more germane to the discussion we're undertaking here, Mr. Speaker, is her status as a former Saskatchewan Heritage Foundation board member, and some of the concerns that Dr. Massey raises around the very things that are the grist of this particular piece of legislation, in terms of the way that foundations are funded by government but are to be at arm's length. There are a number of contentions made around to quote, the current government has allowed its middle and upper management to run roughshod over the SHF, trying to dictate what by law should be an arm's length foundation as a personal fiefdom. After years of growing tension, the government saw fit to quietly let all of the old board members go and appoint an all-new board, no doubt hoping that they would be better at bowing, but the new board members are just as smarter than the old. They have formally cut all ties with the ministry and have hired their own manager and their own grants and finance officer. The board and the staff are dedicated to serving the province of Saskatchewan, as is their mandate. Mr. Speaker, I guess there are a number of points made by this former board member, Dr. Massey, as regards the way that affairs were conducted at the Saskatchewan Heritage Foundation, and again, how that relates to the piece of legislation under question here today, that are fairly concerning. And certainly, Mr. Speaker, in terms of the realignment of the powers that are entailed in the Heritage Property Act, we'll have more questions about those, but we'll certainly have more questions about the contents of this legislation in light of the former board being vacated. What's the status of the relationship between the Saskatchewan Heritage Foundation and the government? And is this the appropriate, proper relationship between these two entities? And again, Mr. Speaker, we ask very serious, very accomplished people across this province to take a hand, to play a role in various boards and agencies, and the kind of disruption that has gone on with this particular board. We'll be looking for more detailed answers from the ministry and from the minister as regards what has gone on here, what is there to be fixed, does Bill 90 fit the bill, and what work might remain, Mr. Speaker. So those are some of the issues we'll be looking to have a more detailed and thoroughgoing discussion on at the committee stage. And at this point, Mr. Speaker, I'd invite my colleague, the Government House Leader, to do what need be done in terms of moving Bill number 90, the Heritage Property Amendment Act 2017, on to committee stage.
Assembly ready for the question? Question before the Assembly is a motion by the Minister that Bill number 90, the Heritage Property Amendment Act 2017, be now read a second time. The pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Second reading of this bill.
To which committee shall this bill be committed? Recognize the Government House Leader.
I designate that Bill number 90, the Heritage Property Amendment Act 2017, be committed to the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
This bill stands committed to the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 6, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 103, the Land Contracts Actions Act 2017. Mr. Witherspoon.
Recognize the member for Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honor to rise this afternoon to enter into the record a few thoughts about the Land Contracts Actions Act prior to allowing it to move on to committee. Now, this bill is seeking to modernize some legislation that is quite old, Mr. Speaker, and essentially it's going to make a few changes to foreclosure proceedings. More specifically, there's some significant changes being made to the pre-action process with respect to foreclosure proceedings, and the minister in his remarks when he provided his second reading speech talked about how the changes are meant to simplify the process. So I'm curious to ask, and I'm looking forward to having the opportunity to ask some questions of the minister about the consultation that went on with respect to this bill and what we're seeing in terms of similar types of legislation in other jurisdictions, Mr. Speaker. From what I understand, there was a report made by the Law Reform Commission a few years ago that sought to implement some changes in this legislation to help modernize foreclosure proceedings in the province, Mr. Speaker. And I'm also curious to know what pieces of the Law Reform Commission's recommendations have yet to be implemented. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to ask a few questions just to ensure that we still have a process, a foreclosure proceeding process that's fair for both borrowers and lenders, Mr. Speaker. But in particular, we want to make sure that because borrowers tend to, as an advocacy body, have less of an impact sometimes when we're talking about changes legislatively, and to make sure that there's still a level of fairness and due process for those borrowers, because when we're talking about foreclosure proceedings, it's a very significant proceeding for an individual to have to go through. Taking away, removing someone's home, their shelter, the roof over their head is a very significant step to do against another individual. So we want to ensure that the process that we have is fair and equitable, Mr. Speaker, especially when we're talking about foreclosures, and the amount of mortgages in arrears in Saskatchewan right now are quite astonishing. And I'm looking at some data from a compilation of banks that have the percentage of mortgages in arrears for 3 or more months. And the Canadian average right now, Mr. Speaker, is 0.24%. But here in Saskatchewan, we're over triple that, actually, at 0.76%, Mr. Speaker, which is quite a significant number. We're actually the highest highest number in the province, or in the country, even higher than the Atlantic provinces, Mr. Speaker, which is quite astonishing, and it speaks to this government's failure to stimulate the economy, the problems that we're hearing from people around the province in terms of trying to maintain jobs and well-paying jobs, Mr. Speaker. So not only that, but when we're talking about this legislation and legislative changes to foreclosure proceedings, it's particularly astute in this province that we are ensuring that our foreclosure proceedings are fair and equitable. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm looking forward to having the opportunity to ask questions of this bill to the minister and his officials. So at this time, I'm ready to allow this Bill 103 to move to committee.
Assembly ready for the question? Question before the Assembly is a motion that by the minister that Bill number 103, the Land Contract Actions Act 2017, be now read a second time. Pleasure to the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Second reading of this bill.
To which committee shall this bill be committed? Recognize Government House Leader.
I designate the Bill number 103, the Land Contract Actions Act 2017, be committed to the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
This bill stands committed to the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 7, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 111, the Municipal Tax Sharing Potash Amendment Act 2017. Ms. Sproul.
As the member for Prince Albert Northcote.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Happy to add some remarks with regards to Bill 111 today, and this is a really important bill, Mr. Speaker, and I've been contacting a lot of stakeholders already and getting some information for this because this is a pretty important bill. When we talk about municipal tax sharing, we saw in the last budget that when the government just instantly decided to no longer honor their contracts with municipalities, with the grants in lieu, and people started worrying about if this act will also be looked into. And so this is regarding the potash revenues. And so the intent creating this system was that municipalities that live near mines were able to benefit from the municipal tax collected from the potash mines, and to ensure that there was proper redistribution of this, the tax revenue sharing. And so that's why within this act, they established the Municipal Potash Tax Sharing Administration Board. And so within the changes to this legislation, there's going to be some adjustments to the board that's responsible for receiving the municipal taxes collected from the potash mines and redistributed to communities that are within a 20-mile radius. One of the initial changes, Mr. Speaker, is that they're going to be changing it from miles to kilometers within the language with the bill. So I understand kilometers more so than miles, but growing up in a farming community, I understand what miles are as well. But so that might be why there were some changes with regards to that. Originally, Mr. Speaker, the board consisted of 2 SARM representatives and 1 municipal government official. And so with changes to this act, they are proposing to have a SUMA representative and a potash representative also on board. And so I think this is a really good start, Mr. Speaker. I know this is something that these municipalities and these organizations have been asking for, is to have more representation on this board that represents all of the individuals that are involved. And I think this would also increase some transparency as well. And so people feeling that they're being represented. So like I said, I think it's a good start, and we can reevaluate in years to come to see if maybe adding potentially more members or not is something that should be looked into. Board members have a term of 1 year, and so with changes with this legislation, they're going to move it from 1 year to 2 years. which I think provides a little bit of stability. I'm going to be asking the minister some questions with regards to what those will look like. Will these 2-year terms alternate? Some agencies do that so that they can provide some stability with regards to their board members. And also learning about how often there are some vacant positions available, how often do they replace board members, how often do they meet. I have a lot of questions with regards to that. So the minister indicated that they consulted with stakeholders, both potash and municipal, and so I know one of the concerns that have been brought to my attention when I've been doing my consultation as well is that cities is not included with this distribution area, and they've been wanting that. They changed the definition of urban municipality within the changes with this legislation, and they added resort villages. And resort villages were seen as being seasonal homes, not properties that weren't used year-round, so they weren't included in the initial definition. But with changes to this legislation, they are now added because they realize that in these resort villages, there are residents that are requiring more long-term services, and so they felt that it would be good to include them with the distribution of these potash revenue. So I think, again, this is a good start, but I know that the SUMA and the urban municipalities have been advocating to have the cities also included under that urban municipalities definition. So there's definitely some questions to be asked with regards to why that's not being included. Also, now that resort villages are within the definition of urban municipalities, will that mean that there will be other changes with regards to how they pay municipal taxes and what that's going to look like with regards to maybe potentially more education taxes or some other taxes that I know that individuals have been inquiring about. They also made some changes with this legislation to include the new mines, because we know that we're going to get a new potash mine outside of Humboldt, which is exciting for the province, and so they wanted to make some changes in here to allow for that addition, and so that's good news. There's a new subsection to allow for new additions, whether it be equipment, buildings, or other taxable items to be added to the revenue remitted to the board for redistribution to municipalities. And I guess that was something that was done before, but not consistently, and so this provides some better level of clarity. So there'll be some questions with regards to asking about how that will work. And the new section clarifies that tax tools are prohibited, but incentives are not, and so municipalities can continue to apply discounts to tax on potash mine assessments. So that's another change, Mr. Speaker. And so, like I said before, this is a really important amendment to this act. There's some really good changes in here that I don't think there'll be a lot of discussion about, but there are some areas that I'll have a lot more questions to ask to the minister. So at this time, I'm going to cease my remarks and send the bill to committee.
Assembly ready for the question? Question before the Assembly is a motion by the Minister that Bill number 111, Municipal Tax Sharing Potash Amendment Act 2017, be now read a second time. Pledge of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Second reading of this bill.
To which committee shall this bill be committed? Recognize Government House Leader.
To Bill number 111, the Municipal Tax Sharing Potash Amendment Act 2017, be committed to the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
This bill stands committed to the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Government orders, adjourned debates. Item number 8, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 113, the the Planning and Development Amendment Act 2017. Ms. Beck.
Recognize the member for Prince Albert, North Dakota.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is another act that is being amended that will impact municipalities, and so it's been one that I've been looking through quite thoroughly, and will be having some more discussion with stakeholders because, like I said before, this is a really important piece of legislation, and some of the changes here are going to have a great impact on municipalities. So some of the changes here that I've noted is that this is going to improve Saskatchewan's land use planning framework, and it's supposed to potentially save money. And so there isn't much detail of who does it save money. Does it save money for the municipalities? Does it save money for the provinces? And so there'll be a lot of questions with regards to that. This helps municipalities plan regionally, support opportunities for municipal and provincial infrastructure to service department, clarifies a planning process for the use of municipal revenues for school purposes, and address municipal or miscellaneous items. And so there's a lot of discussion here, Mr. Speaker, with regards to how the changes in this bill will help this government with regards to creating schools within municipalities. And so some of the comments that the minister indicated was that they want to promote having schools being built on municipal land, and that in 2014 there was 9 joint use schools that were built on municipal reserve, which saved $36 million in land acquisition costs. I think it's really important that we get a breakdown of those numbers and understanding if municipalities receive any benefit with regards to allowing this land to be used by the education system and financially, because I think municipalities have been very friendly and worked really closely with other agencies within our government. But we've got to be mindful, Mr. Speaker, that in the recent years, municipalities have been greatly impacted with the cuts from this government, cuts to funding and cuts to different programs that they had and that they were given. And now we hear that they're going to make some changes with the revenue sharing formula. So we know that municipalities also, though, have to keep their books in balance, and their community members are going to expect certain services delivered to them because that's what their taxes are going to. So I think we have to have a little bit more discussion with regards to that on how much this is going to impact the municipal sector. There's regional partnerships, make it easier. We know that regional partnerships make it easier and more cost-effective for municipalities to grow together. So it sounds like this government is looking at encouraging municipalities to go into more of a regional aspect. And so this helps provide some flexibility with municipalities to plan regionally and manage areas of common interest, which I think has been something that all levels of municipal sectors have been embracing. We're Saskatchewan, we all work together, and we know our neighbors are our neighbors, and we like to work in common grounds. So it's nice to see that the government is looking at that as an aspect as well. But again, we have to look at how do we, as the provincial government, help these municipalities build these relationships together on a common ground, and not have some of these agreements maybe impact different municipalities more than others, and how can we maybe help them work better together. So there'll be some discussion on that. I know there's been some areas that have done more with regards to that than others. There's also to require municipalities to have land use planning policies for development by railway operations streamlining the process for approving authorities to enter into development levy agreements, improving procedures of the Sask Municipal Board's Planning Appeals Committee, and modernizing the maximum fee for appeals to local development and appeal boards. So that is a lot of different changes there, Mr. Speaker, and so I think it's really important that we look at each and every one of them to see how that's going to impact municipalities. So will this cost municipalities more for staffing costs? How much is this going to impact them? So, and I think with the fee raising from $50 to $300, about how many people will that impact? How many stakeholders will see that increase? So I think those will be some really good questions on how many people pay that fee and what that will look like. The minister continues to have the ability to require municipalities to amend their official community plan to be consistent with provincial interest. I know this is something that they felt was important to keep within this legislation. So how often has this been happening? How often does the minister step into municipalities and ask them to readjust their community plans? Those are going to be some really good questions to ask. There are many changes throughout this bill that will impact municipalities and how they can plan, develop, and address regional issues, Mr. Speaker. And like I said before, I'll be certainly having some discussions with municipalities and other stakeholders and about how this bill will impact them and follow up with the minister in committee. So at this point, Mr. Speaker, I cease my remarks and allow this bill to go to committee.
Assembly ready for the question? The question for the Assembly is a motion by the minister that bill number 113, the Planning and Development Amendment Act 2017, be now read a second time. Pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried. To which committee shall this bill be committed? Oh, you want it? You want to go? To which committee shall this bill be committed?
Bill number 113, 113, the Planning and Development Amendment Act 2017, be committed to Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
This bill stands committed to the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Government orders adjourned debates. Item number 10, resume debate in the second reading. Motion on Bill number 115, the Residential Tenancy Amendment Act 2017. Ms. Beck.
Recognize a member for Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honor to rise this afternoon to enter some remarks regarding Bill 115, the Residential Tenancies Amendment Act. Now, this is an interesting piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker, and I talked about it a little bit when I was speaking about the cannabis bill. There's a few pieces of legislation that are coming forward this session that deal directly with the pending legalization of cannabis. This is one of them, and I'll just summarize a little bit what this bill is seeking to do. So this bill will give landlords new powers to make rules, quote, prohibiting the possession, use, selling, or distribution of cannabis or the growing and possession of cannabis plants, end quote. It also gives the Office of Residential Tenancies hearing officers new powers to refuse to allow an application from a tenant who is in contravention of an ORT order. So this is a provision that's not related to cannabis. So I'll move back actually to the original, the first point that I was talking about. So this, like I said, this bill will allow landlords, if they choose to make rules around whether or not tenants can possess, use, sell, distribute, distribute cannabis and grow or possess cannabis plants, Mr. Speaker. We've heard some concerns, and I think there are some pretty legitimate concerns about what happens for individuals who are tenants of a residential property where the landlord has restricted the possession, use, selling, or distributing cannabis, and in particular use, Mr. Speaker, when it's also not allowed per the Cannabis Control Act to use cannabis in public. So it really limits where people can use cannabis, although it will be, again, I stress, a legal substance. Mr. Speaker, there's nowhere that an individual who is a tenant can actually consume cannabis unless they're lucky enough to have a friend who owns their own property, or they have a friend who lives in a rental unit where the landlord hasn't created these rules. I also have some questions around allowing the landlord to make a rule around prohibiting possession of cannabis. In particular, I think the argument that was made at the time of the introduction of this bill is that we want to be able to treat, or by we I mean landlords want to be able to treat cannabis similar to tobacco, Mr. Speaker, and how the use of cannabis can sometimes have a negative effect on other people who live in a rental complex, Mr. Speaker. For like if it's an apartment style complex, how difficult that can be if one person is using cannabis in their home, how quickly it can radiate into other units, Mr. Speaker. But possession is a different thing. Now, I understand potentially why there would be rules around giving the landlord authority to tell someone whether or not they can smoke cannabis in their rental unit. But used cannabis can also include baked products, Mr. Speaker, which has no negative effect on a neighbor. And making rules around whether or not you can possess cannabis, too, Mr. Speaker, seems a little extreme when it will be legal to have that substance. There's no rules around whether or not you can possess tobacco. So there are some points here where the argument that it should be equitable to tobacco stray, Mr. Speaker. So we're going to be asking a lot of questions around that, whether or not there's some concerns around charter rights here, and whether they think it'll stand up, whether there's been some legal advice onto whether or not it'll stand up any potential challenges. Moving along this bill, it also gives the Office of Residential Tenancies, like I said, hearing officers new powers to refuse to allow an application from a tenant who's in contravention of an ORT order, and it also forces tenants to continue to pay their rent for the duration of the appeal process when appealing the ORT's decision to grant the landlord possession of a rental unit for rent arrears, Mr. Speaker. But the final point that this bill is seeking to accomplish is the last one that I want to really touch on, which allows landlords to dispose of property worth less than $1,500 without an order from the ORT when a tenancy ends or property is abandoned. Now, Mr. Speaker, I've been hearing some concerns from stakeholders in the province, and so has my colleague, the member for Saskatoon Fairview, who is our housing critic, about this portion of the bill, as well as the cannabis portion that I have already spoken to. But there are some pretty legitimate concerns about the power that this is providing, and what we've been hearing are the problems around landlords because the provisions around how property is deemed to be valued at a certain price allows for some landlords to essentially value a lot of things under $1,500 and then seek to dispose that property, Mr. Speaker. And it's quite some of the rules around how the notice provisions aren't very stringent, Mr. Speaker. There's some pretty serious concerns about the power that's going to have on folks. One instance in particular that we're thinking about when we're thinking about someone who has abruptly ended or had to abandon property are in situations of domestic violence, Mr. Speaker, and how devastating that can be for a tenant when their property can be destroyed by the landlord, Mr. Speaker, with a very low bar in terms of attempts made to reach the individual who is the owner of that property, Mr. Speaker. Sometimes, for many folks, that property that they've left behind are the only pieces of property that they have, So that can be quite devastating to an individual when that property is disposed of, Mr. Speaker. So I'm going to be asking quite a few questions around that provision, as well as that first provision around rules around cannabis in rental units. Mr. Speaker, I think these are important discussions that we're having, and I and my colleague, the critic for housing, have already received quite a bit of feedback with respect to this bill. So I'm looking forward to putting those concerns on the record and asking some further questions of the minister and his officials at committee. So at this time, I'm prepared to allow Bill 115 to move forward to committee.
Is the Assembly ready for the question? The question for the Assembly is a motion by the Minister that, Bill number 115, the Residential Tenancies Amendment Act 2017, be now read a second time. Pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Second reading of this bill.
To which committee shall this bill be committed?
I designate that Bill number 115, the Residential Tenancies Amendment Act 2017, be committed to the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Hear, hear.
This bill stands committed to the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Government orders, adjourned debates. Item number 12, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 125, the Saskatchewan Value-Added Agricultural Incentive Act. Ms. Beck.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is a pleasure to rise today to provide some thoughts on Bill number 125, the Saskatchewan Value-Added Agriculture Incentive Act. This bill creates a 15% non-refundable tax credit for value-added agriculture facilities on new capital investment. Companies are going to be required to apply to the government for a certificate, which is an SVAI certificate, Saskatchewan Value-Added Agriculture Incentive Certificate, which just rolls right off the tongue. In order to be eligible for an SVAI certificate, an applicant must invest at least $10 million in new capital and submit to inspections from government officials to ensure that all the rules are being followed. And redemption of the benefits is limited to 20% in year one after the facility enters operation, 30% in year two, and 50% in year three, Mr. Speaker. There will be a maximum carry forward of 10 years on any remaining credit amount. I started to ask a few questions in committee about this particular bill, Mr. Speaker, but the bill had not yet been introduced. So I asked about some of the particulars about how this incentive will create jobs, as that's one of the claims that's presented in the budget, Mr. Speaker. I asked about other models for tax incentives that have been used and whether there was a particular model that this was being shaped after. And so I was looking to find out if there's some precedent of creating this tax incentive and evidence that creating a tax incentive like this does lead to jobs in the industry. So I think those are some important questions, and that I will have an opportunity to ask those questions in committee. And we will have questions about the evidence that is provided here, the consultation that took place in drafting this bill, Mr. Speaker. But I'm happy to allow this bill to move to committee so that we will have an opportunity to ask those questions and to hear back from the minister on what some of the rationale was for creating this incentive, Mr. Speaker. So I'll keep my remarks brief and allow this bill to move on to committee.
Is the Assembly ready for the question? The question before the Assembly is a motion by the Minister that Bill number 115, the Residential Tenancies Amendment Act 2017, be now read a second time. Pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Bill 125.
I would like to have a do-over. Question before the Assembly is a motion by the Minister that Bill number 125, the Saskatchewan Value Added Agriculture Incentive Act, be now read a second time. Pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Second reading of this bill.
To which committee shall this bill be committed? Recognize Government House.
I designate that Bill number 125, the Saskatchewan Value Added Agriculture Incentive Act, be committed to the Standing Committee on Economy.
This bill stands committed to the Standing Committee on Economy.
Orders, adjourn debates. Item number 13, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 126, the Energy Export Act. Ms. Mowat.
As a member for Saskatoon-Nutana.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to be able to rise in the Assembly today and enter into the debate on Bill number 126, an act respecting energy exports. As you know, Mr. Speaker, this bill is fairly new on the scene here in the Assembly and was brought in very quickly a couple of weeks ago, I believe, in order to address a current issue that is facing the people of Canada right now and some disputes, interprovincial disputes. It was brought in on April 24th, 2018. And I know that this is a reaction to some of the events that we see taking place in Alberta and British Columbia right now, and obviously having a very significant impact on our ability to sell Saskatchewan oil products at the best price that we can. And we know the differential is great, and it's one that is impacting our industry as it now stands. So this is a critical debate in our nation, and certainly we see the stakes, what's at stake for the provinces of Alberta and British Columbia. And the vexing problem of getting pipelines built in this country is one that's really hurting our industry here in Canada. So I think it's understandable to see the debate enroll as it has, and certainly concerns on both sides of the issue that are being represented by the provinces of British Columbia and Alberta, and obviously the product, the diluted bitumen that's being proposed to be shipped in the new Kinder Morgan pipeline is a product that needs to get to market in order to be viable, and of course concerns about the content of that diluted bitumen is one that's also up for discussion. However, Mr. Speaker, I think we need to look at this bill as it stands here in Saskatchewan, and you know, it's going to have a serious impact if it comes to fruition on current business for a number of producers, oil and gas producers and refineries here in Saskatchewan. So there's a lot of questions about who this is going to impact, how many jobs will be impacted by it if it comes to fruition. It seems to have cooled down a little bit now, Mr. Speaker, as Alberta hasn't moved forward with its bill recently, but we know that the end of May is a deadline that's been imposed by the pipeline company, Kinder Morgan, and there's a lot of speculation about that deadline as well and what's motivating that, and whether Kinder Morgan is serious or not, or whether they're getting cold feet for other reasons. So lots of opinions out there to sort through, Mr. Speaker. Had the opportunity to listen to Michael Enright on Sunday morning a couple weekends ago, and it was sort of a primer for people of Canada who weren't really sure what the issues were, and I found that to be really useful, and there was a very helpful speaker on that program. So I think this is something we need to continue to learn and listen from, and ensure that you know, the people of Saskatchewan's best interests are continuously put out front, and whether or not this bill does that, I think is a matter of debate, and obviously I think we have questions. So certainly we're going to want to look at that when we get to the committee on this bill. One of the things I found very interesting was the kind of the key phrase in the Alberta bill and its similarities in the Saskatchewan bill. There's some clauses that have been copied verbatim from the Alberta bill, and there are several clauses that were written presumably locally here by officials who understand the for example, the definition of oil in Saskatchewan is a very particular definition and has been refined, no pun intended, throughout the years. And so that definition has remained rather than the definitions being used in the Alberta bill. It's highly technical, and I think when you rush the passage of a bill like this, there is opportunities for error to be present. So I think this is something we need to take a very, very close look at with the officials once we have an opportunity to discuss it in committee. The one section I do want to talk about today is in the Alberta bill, it's section 2 sub 3, and in the Saskatchewan bill under it's section 3 sub 3. And just noting that there's actually two parts to this. And the first part of the bill in Alberta says before they make an order to stop, for example, flowing oil and gas to BC, it says they will they will do so having regard to, and this is sub A of the clause, whether adequate pipeline capacity exists to maximize the return on crude oil and diluted bitumen produced in Alberta, and B is whether adequate supplies and reserves of natural gas, crude oil, and refined fuels will be available for Alberta's present and future needs. And in Saskatchewan's clause, so that's in Alberta's Act is 2 sub 3 A and B. Saskatchewan's clause is clause 3 sub 3. And this is in B. So sub 3 says, in making a recommendation for the purposes of the section, the minister, B, must have regard to whether the proposed designation is, in the minister's opinion, in the public interest, considering all or any of the following matters. I, whether adequate pipeline capacity exists to maximize the return on oil and gas produced in Saskatchewan, and number 2, or II, whether adequate supplies and reserves of oil, gas, and refined products will be available for Saskatchewan's present and future needs. And the only reason I raise that today, Mr. Speaker, is because I'm interested in the first part of those considerations. Sorry, the second part of the considerations. The first part is what the debate is about. Adequate pipeline capacity. So we know what that debate is, but it's the second piece that I find very interesting, and this is whether or not Alberta in their act or Saskatchewan in our act has adequate supplies of oil, gas, and refined products for present and future needs. So this is something I do want to ask the minister about and the officials when we get to committees. If this bill passes, this means that we could actually stop flowing oil under any contract if we need it more here in Saskatchewan. And I know that much of our oil and gas is spoken for already through contracts. So I'm finding that that is something I really do want to be able to have a good discussion on, is whether, like, the bills, I think, goes much further than what was attempted or what the public debate is about today, which is pipeline capacity. This second clause actually takes it much further than that. So we're going to have definitely questions about that, Mr. Speaker, as we go into the committee discussion on this, and we'll be interested to see what the minister has to say about that. But at this point, you know, it's a highly political bill. I think it's a moving target, and I think we will see as the next couple weeks roll out whether or not this bill will need to be passed. Perhaps Kinder Morgan and the federal government, who's responsible for pipelines, will sort out something that will allow this project to go forward. So we're hoping that the federal government will step up and do what they need to do, and so provinces aren't drawn into these nasty discussions. But until then, we will continue to debate the bill and hopefully have an opportunity committee to discuss it. So at this point, Mr. Speaker, I don't have anything further to add to the bill.
Assembly ready for the question? Question before the Assembly is a motion by the Minister that Bill number 126, the Energy Export Act, be now read a second time. Pleasure to the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Second reading of this bill.
To which committee shall this bill be committed? Recognize House Leader.
I designate the Bill 126, the Energy Export Act, be committed to the Standing Committee on Economy.
This bill stands committed to the Standing Committee on Economy. Recognize member on his feet.
To adjourn the House so committees may sit tonight.
It has been moved by the Government House Leader that this Assembly now adjourn. Pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried. This Assembly Now stand adjourned until tomorrow at 1:30 p.m.